Prosecutors have claimed in the West Australian Supreme Court that Perth barrister Lloyd Rayney may have been planning to kill his wife 2 days before she was murdered. The court heard further details today about their fractured relationship, including allegations he'd said he hated her while she'd described him as a snake and a wicked man. The claims were made on the third day of his willful murder trial, which also saw the court release an image of Lloyd Rayney's bush grave. Joanna Minna reports from Perth.
This is a computer-generated image showing how Lloyd Rayney was found in a grave in Kings Park. As prosecutors described it, she was head down and face up, with her head the furthest from the surface. They say her killer deliberately buried her that way to encourage the decomposition of her head and neck. That's because prosecutors claim it was those parts of her body where she'd suffered fatal injuries after what's alleged to be a significant assault. It's claimed she was taken in her car to Kings Park by her husband, Lloyd Rayney, after he'd murdered her at their Como home as their young daughter slept upstairs. In the second day of his opening statement, prosecutor John Aegis said gouge and scuff marks on the boot-scooting boots Mrs Rayney was wearing showed she'd been dragged across brick paving at the home. Mr Aegis outlined evidence that would be called, showing what he described as the parlous state of the Rayney marriage. That included Mr Rayney telling a former colleague a month before Lloyd Rayney's death that he hated his wife. The prosecution would also call friends of Mrs Rayney and her sister, who would testify that she'd described him as a wicked man who'd slept around behind her back for many years. Mrs Rayney had also expressed concern about her husband's gambling. The court heard he'd lost tens of thousands of dollars in the year before, gambling on sports and events such as the Logies and TV's Dancing on Ice. She'd also claimed that he'd been accepting shady deals from clients, including Hancock Prospecting. Mr Aegis later read details of an email written by Mrs Rayney in which she said she was living with a snake well known in legal circles. It's intolerable. Prosecutors alleged Mr Rayney knew what his wife was saying about him because he'd bugged their home telephone, and it was claimed that showed how far he'd go to remain in control of his wife and his children. Mr Aegis then suggested that Mr Rayney may have planned his wife's death, saying that as early as the 5th of August he'd been thinking about a final solution as far as his wife was concerned. Earlier, the court heard an allegation that about a year after Mrs Rayney's murder, Lloyd Rayney told an employee at his law chambers that there was an attempt to frame him in connection with his wife's death. The claims related to the discovery of a place card with his name on it near the burial site days before Mrs Rayney's body was found, and to police finding his wife's car in a street where people lived that he knew. The court will now turn its attention to inspecting those sites as well as the Rayneys' home. Joanna Minna, Lateline.